nationalism isn't a bad word. And that comes right after the alarming truth, or the should be boring to most people. There are 3 branches of government, not 4. Okay? Now, the fact that you have to say this, somebody who's taken a 5th grade civics class should be able to tell you that.
They'll say, of course, Vivek.
Yeah, of course that's true. Well, it turns out, I think that's probably the most important chapter of the book. Actually, I'll probably pause on that, is the people we elect to run the government, they're not the ones who run the government. And this book comes out this year, has come out this year now. It's an important time for that chapter to hit home because the Supreme Court has completely changed the game. I mean, we're here looking at our main man here, Clarence Thomas, right here. I feel like if he was in the room with
doctrine,
us.
Right?
Absolutely. So we're talking about overturning the Chevron doctrine.
Can you educate our audience on that? It's kind of wonky.
It's a really big freaking deal. Like, it goes to the stuff that we fought the American Revolution for. And I know that sounds crazy to say for a seemingly dry subject. The American Revolution was fought to say that we, the people, create a government that's accountable to us. Turns out that's not the government we live in today, where most rules, most enforcement actions are taken by bureaucrats who were never elected to their positions and historically have been viewed as unfireable even by the people we actually do elect. Millions of federal bureaucrats in 3-letter agencies. That was worsened by a doctrine, and a little known fact is even Scalia was, I think, one of his poorest decisions in favor of this doctrine at the time, the Chevron doctrine, where they said that federal courts defer to the administrative agency's interpretations of the law that Congress passes, which ultimately puts them in the driver's seat. That was overturned this year in a case called Loper-Bright. That's a big freaking deal. And so this chapter looks at that post-Loper world. It's not just Loper. There was also a big case 2 years ago called West Virginia versus EPA.
That was
this is seismic, right? So this one basically said that if anything has a major economic impact or policy impact, thousands of dollars per person in the country, that's the threshold they set. If that's kind of impact it has, and your agency is writing a rule, that rule is unconstitutional because it had to go through the process of democratically elected lawmakers. So just the combination of those 2 cases alone, and then there's a third one I got to mention, which is SEC versus JARCASY.
Yep.
That one said that, what happens with these agencies is they write the rules, they enforce the rules, but they also have these judges that sit within their agencies that decide the cases. Sometimes, usually 99% of the cases go in favor of the agency. Big surprise. That completely violates the separation of powers. The Supreme Court shot that down this year as well. And agencies like the SEC and the EPA have a horrendous track record over the last several years in the Supreme Court and in the federal courts losing their cases. So think about this. If the top law enforcement agencies are failing to actually follow the law themselves, that breeds a distrust of the rule of law in our country. But the good news is the game has now changed because of the Supreme Court. So this book exposes what that post-Chevron, post-Loper, post-West Virginia versus EPA world looks like. And it turns out if you combine that with the second Trump term, where we're and after include this, include that with a second Trump term, not just to say that Trump got elected, but like actually the values that got Trump elected get translated into action, which I'm keen on. Then this is actually the stuff of reviving 1776 principles in America, 1789 principles, the Constitutional Convention. We actually turned that back into reality. And that's bottom up through litigation, where you have a lot of people who are unfairly persecuted by the regulatory state, able to now go to federal courts for actual respite and rescue. But also President Trump, and I have my views on how we ought to do this, top down, being able to say the executive branch has way overreached in its power. The administrative state technically sits under the executive branch. And so we're going to curb that. We're going to rescind all these regulations. We could fire millions of bureaucrats to go along with it. Personally, that's the mass deportation that I think is at the top of the list, is the mass deportation of millions of unelected bureaucrats out of Washington, D.C. to the rest of the country and the private sector where they could probably do better work anyway. And I think that we are, to your point, go vote now, we're within striking distance of making that true, both bottom up and top down. And certainly when I think about a second Trump term, that's the thing I'm most passionate about, is gutting that administrative state. I think there's 2 visions of America First here. And I talk about this in the book, too. There's 2 strands of America First. So the book is Truths, the Future of America First. There's a strand of America First that says, good people we respect, who I love, or colleagues, who might say that we need to use some of these regulatory agencies to advance a pro-worker, pro-American agenda. And I understand the temptation to do it, but I come down on the other side of this. I think the right answer is just to get in there and shut it down fast, shut it down bigly, in a big way. And if you end up cutting some muscle, fine. You can always add that back, but don't take the risk of not cutting enough fat. I think that makes our movement stronger when we're able to have that kind of debate. And I expose a little bit of that daylight, even within the America First movement in this book as well.
So let's emphasize the administrative state. What is a 1, 2, 3 step move Trump can do like day one? Like you've done some research on this.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot more authority the president has than people realize.
Oh, of course, because the executive branch sits under the U.S. president. So most of the New York Times pages will say President Trump's going to rule by fiat, rule like a dictator because he wants to constrain the power of these agencies. It's the other way around. The Supreme Court has said these agencies do not have the power to be writing these rules. And so President Trump can exhibit humility for the executive branch to say, we never had the power to promulgate this nonsense anyway. So what are the steps? Here are the steps. Put a constitutionally trained lawyer in every one of these agencies and say, which regulations failed the Supreme Court standards in the Chevron case and in the West Virginia versus EPA case? That would be most federal regulations. Roll that up into one executive order and say those are null and void. On day one, we're not enforcing any of those, and we put them into the process for rescinding those regulations. Next step. Well, if you have 75% fewer regulations, that gives you what's called a rational basis for a mass headcount reduction. So I use these words carefully because
I love where you're going with this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I use these words carefully because historically what they would say is the civil service rules protect the bureaucrats from being fired. And I talk about this in detail in the book. Those civil service rules do not apply to mass firings, especially if they're done with an organizational logic. So if the organizational logic is the Supreme Court's told us these regulations are already unconstitutional, 75% of them are done by an executive order, say we're not enforcing them and we're rescinding them. Well, then what the heck are these 4 million people doing sitting around here either? I'm not discriminating based on your political ideology or certainly your race or your gender. No, it's just a mass firing across the board, rationally tied to the number of regulations that you rescinded as well. I think that could get done early. I think that could get done fast. I think it's going to take a combination of both having an understanding of how to massively streamline an organization, but to combine that with a little bit of the constitutional law here. So it takes a special sauce to, I think, get this done right. But personally, that's what I'm most passionate about. Get in there, get started quickly. Will there be some legal challenges? Absolutely. But the Supreme Court is on our side on this. They've already demonstrated that. This is the stuff of how you save a country. And I think that if we go the other direction of saying that, hey, we got to, replace some of these people at the FCC or you could pick your favorite agency, EPA, FTC, CFPB, and maybe get them to do some good stuff, Department of Education. No, we have failed if we take that road. I think we see that temptation sometimes arise in our movement. I say forget about that. Get in there, break it, burn the ashes, and save a country.
If there's duplication, right, between certain cabinet agencies, you can just eliminate them.
You could shut them down. It's what I call deleting, the delete function.
It's the President Reorganization Act or something?
Yeah, exactly. Presidential Reorganization Act of 1977. We talk about that in the book as well. There's certain provisions of that act that are unexpired, which say that if it promotes efficiency of operations in government, promotes economy, couple of different factors. The president already has the authority granted by Congress under that statute to shut down and reorganize that.
So we could merge Department of Education, Department of Energy, just, or what would that look like?
You could shut down the Department of Education, move a couple of the workforce training functions to the Department of Labor, and then the loan collections that are outstanding, move it to Treasury. That's what that looks like. We could go straight down the list.
So just to be clear, that Trump could, if he were to win on day one, just shut down the Department of Education.
Yes, absolutely.
And without Congress.
Yes. That's going to be a legally contested view. I think the Supreme Court's on our side of this. I think that if it falls into the categories I believe it does in promoting the efficiency of operations in government, promotes economy, and also actually eliminates redundant agencies through those redundancies, that's absolutely on the table.
Where are there other redundancies that are obvious?
We could talk about this a lot in the national security state. Now, this gets into territory that we probably are.
DHS has a lot of this too.
Yeah, I mean, you could think of
it. Shouldn't even exist, DHS.
I mean, George W. Bush, thanks.
Well, I mean, and it's not just one. I mean, the redundancies across the board. That's probably best discussed after the election, given where we stand right now. But I do think that there are redundancies rife everywhere in the federal law enforcement and national security establishment.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So Charlie has gone viral recently for saying you're not electing just a president. You're electing the 5,000 people that he's going to appoint to positions of power.
Yeah.
How do you put that idea together with the power that they would flex, that they would use, combined with the fact that we are, sort of admitting that we want ultimately these agencies to have a limited power.
So let's do the math on this. There's 4 million federal bureaucrats. A 75% headcount reduction means 3 million of them are out. That's still a million in. 5,000 is still a lot less than a million. So I'm not saying that there's no federal employees, right? But the key people you want are the people who are actually going to translate your agenda enacted by the people of this country into action.
And you could make the argument that you're actually firing people that are ultimately going to try and sabotage your vision anyways.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not what you're saying. That's not the argument you're making. I think that's important. But we saw this in the first Trump term.
It's definitely true.
Where you saw it in the first Trump term where these ideas would, or the policy agendas would get pushed down and they would fall apart somewhere along the way.
Right. So there's two different, I appreciate you brought that up, Andrew. There's two different visions here. One is we have a bureaucracy populated by individuals who are the enemy. That's one view. And I'm sympathetic to that. My view is slightly different. The bureaucracy is the enemy. And I think that that's going to have slightly different actions, even within America First here, about what you would take. In my view, the bureaucracy is the enemy in the first place. And I think that we could go fast, go early. I think you got to go early, or else this system, it's like a beast. It finds a way to entrench itself and fight back. But for now, I'll leave it at that in terms of what I think needs to happen.
What's the next truth?
Yeah, so the next truth is we got to nationalism isn't a bad word. It's the N-word that people are afraid to say. But I do think that actually there's a positive nationalism is the case that I make for. And here here's also one of these areas where I think we can have probably room for debate, even in our own America First movement. And that's part of what in the second half of the book, first half of the book is about preaching truths to the left. The second half of the book is about opening up the conversations that I think make our own movement stronger. So I lay out the differences between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. And historically, nationalism is associated with ethno-nationalism. And I'm not even starting from a standpoint that's inherently bad in every country, but in the American context, civic nationalism is the case that I make in this book.